After 3 weeks of PTR testing and spending way too much time on both 10 and 25-man heroic, I feel like my perception of what gear we ought to pursue has changed quite a bit from my initial expectations. And this video is about sharing precisely everything I've learned and what gear sets I recommend going into Dragon Soul, what gear to pursue while focusing on progression, and most importantly, what gear will give you the biggest DPS output so you can blast the meters with the 30% damage buff once we get there. By the way, these sets were posted on the Riyani Discord weeks ago, and that's pretty much always will get the information first. Just like last phase, I'll be posting a full written guide with tips for tanks to keep in mind as I start progressing Dragon Soul. So if you want to stay up to date with that coming out, make sure to join the Discord channel. Okay, so like always, take BIS list for Bloody K with a grain of salt, as what your group needs may differ from what I recommend to the majority of DKs. It's very important to keep in mind that DK gearing exists on a spectrum between full beef mode and full parse brain, and where you should be on this spectrum will be different for everyone. But for the first time in the Cataclysm expansion, I'll recommend that you go further towards the beef side of that spectrum, at least until the percent buffs comes out. Dragon Soul bosses certainly do slap quite hard, and if you're reckless with your talents and gearing, you'll turn yourself into a burden for your raid, especially on 25-man. Before we take a look at the gear sets, let's talk about stats. Your stat priority will be exactly the same as for Firelands, and I'll put them on the screen right now. For 10-man, I recommend going for a balanced approach, and for 25-man, I would recommend putting a little bit more emphasis on mastery than you may have in the past. Once we're full BIS and have upwards of 30% increase in HP, damage and absorbs, you can certainly go full DPS with little to no downside. Okay, enough with the rambling, let's dive into some actual BIS lists. Before we look at the phase 4 BIS, let's look at the BIS sets that you will take into Dragon Soul progression. The reason why this video took forever to come out was that I was expecting them to do something wild with LFR loot, and boy was I right. As a Bloody K, your BIS gear for Dragon Soul progression changes a ton with the new loot system, and if you're raiding right on release, get ready to spend a few days in the new Heroic Plus system. With that said, here is what I recommend going into week 1 progression on 25-man. The first thing you may notice is the Tank LFR 4 set. This set bonus is quite broken during progression. While the 2 set is quite whatever, the 4 set takes 50% of the value from Vampiric Blood and gives it to the full raid group. This means that every minute, you can give your raid 7.5% increased health and 12.5% increased healing taken. And with the raid damage profile of this raid, that will be incredibly high value. This effect can be glyphed as well to give the raid 20% increase healing taken and 0% increased health gain, but generally you want to leave this unglyphed. This bonus is still strong on 10-man, but less so than 25-man, and the closer your raid gets to full BIS, the less need there will be for the raid to have this set bonus. That being said, during progression, run with this set unless there is a very specific reason for you not doing so. In addition to the 4 set, you want to pick up Indomitable Pride, Haste Mastering, and Haste Mass Belt from the Heroic Plus system. You may want to pick up Girthlac and the 2 DPS trinkets from Dragon Soul if there's specific use for it, like off-tanking on bosses like Sonos, or if you want to run with DPS trinket to meet DPS check on Ultraxian, but generally, these will be lower on the priority list. If you do decide to run a DPS trinket, then Bone Link Fetish will outperform Crash by a significant amount when there is more than one target, but performs almost identically on single target. Both of these are better than Heart Rage, so it's time to retire our faithful soldier after many months of use. Another trinket you may have questions about why I've included in the BIS list is Veil of Lights from the new Hour of Twilight dungeons. This trinket may not look like much on the surface, but once you realize that it has a 20-second proc with a 50-second internal cooldown, it becomes way more interesting. This trinket has close to 40% uptime, and once you sim it against other alternatives, it becomes very clear that it's a very attractive alternative. Another option, which is exactly the same but with a mastery proc instead, is the trinket from the new Dark Moon Fair PvP tournament, but good luck getting that before raid release. Then we have the Valor gear. Assuming you have full BIS from Firelands, then Cloak is the best alternative, especially since it's BIS for the rest of the phase. However, there is of course a world where you haven't been able to pick up your BIS pieces, and then the neck or the ring might be a better alternative for you in the short term. Since Blizzard decided to release the raid the same week that the patch is released, it means you can only get 1600 Valor during the first week of Dragon Soul. meaning that neck, cloak, ring, wrist, and relic are the only available options for us during that week. But of course, since the wrist are BOE, you can either buy a pair from the auction house or farm out the Valor on a second character and mail them over to your main. Second week, you'll have a few more options at your disposal, including BOE boots that are extremely good, but at this point, simply pick up whatever's the highest upgrade for you. If you're interested in pumping some big numbers, then Rotting Skull from Valor will add about 200 DPS compared to the LFR alternatives. Okay, so 10-man. Honestly, I don't recommend doing too many changes from the 25-man pre-Dragon Soul set. Swap over one trinket, put on a crit meta gem, and call it a day. You can opt for some more aggressive alternatives, like using Necklace of Fetish or Reputation Ring from Exalted with Avengers of Hydro, but in general, I recommend erring on the side of caution during week 1. Using Girthlack on 10-man may be more attractive, especially if you're missing the maze from Rag, which most of us indeed are. Looking at Phase 4 BIS, we really have 4 alternative sets to go for. 2 balance sets with 1 tank 4 set and 1 DPS 4 set, 1 full send DPS parts brain set, and 1 full beef set. Let's start out with the first balance set. This set stars the tank 4 set for the reasons we mentioned earlier, with the DPS tier helmet as the best off-piece option. You'll run 3 Valor options with the neck, cloak, and relic, along with most of the items you might expect. Girthlack does an absolute insane amount of damage, and it's absolutely worth the secondary stat loss if you can get your hands on one. Our second best option is almost a 2000 DPS loss, so obviously cozy up to the loot council starting right now. For our trinkets, either of the stamina trinkets will do just fine, but I prefer Indomitable Pride due to the large melee swings in this raid. The Sims seem to back that up as well. Offensive trinket-wise, you'll ideally like to run with Kresh, but Bone Link will perform better once you add a secondary target. Vial of Shadows, the agility trinket, does in fact scale with Vengeance and is almost identical in DPS to Bone Link on single target. Obviously, don't take this trinket, but it's worth keeping in mind if no one else needs it. None of the other trinkets in this tier are really worth looking at. The fourth behind Vial is Heart of Rage, then Rotting Skull, and only after that does Eye of the Unmaking, the stacking strength trinket, make an appearance. The link to the full set is in the description. For the second balance set, we run the exact same build, but swap over the tank 4 set for the DPS 4 set. As strong as the tank 4 set is during progression, it really quite quickly becomes unnecessary, especially on 10-man. The DPS tier is extremely well statted for us in every single piece, and we get to use the high-value shoulders from Spine of Deathwing as our off-piece. Have talked to your raid lead, and if both of you agree that the raid-wide Vamp Blood is not offering the raid that much utility anymore, then this is what I would use. Next up, which I'm sure a lot of you might have been waiting for, is the full DPS set. This set uses all 5 DPS pieces as they just happen to be the best statted option for us in Dragon Soul. Unsurprisingly, we use Girthlack for our weapon, with Kresh and Bone Link for our BIS trinkets. Once we start looking at the off-pieces, however, the list becomes rather wild. Since basically all of the off-pieces have mastery on them in this tier, if we want to maximize our DPS potential, then that means we need to use lower item level pieces to pump bigger numbers. That means crafted bracers, trash drop belt, Valor boots, neck and cloak, relic from last tier, ring from last tier, and the agility ring from Hagara. Yes, you heard that right. The agility ring will be your best DPS option. Lastly, we have the full beef set. This set I wouldn't recommend going for unless it's for a very specific reason, like solo tanking Blackhorn, Ultraxian, or Yorsach. Especially once we get the 30% HP and absorb buff, this set becomes very overkill and you will likely be able to offer more to the raid by making some smart and informed offensive trades, even if you really value being overly defensive. Link to all the sets are in the description. I want to reiterate how fluid Blood Decay gearing really is. Don't blindly follow BIS lists, but actually think about the choices you're making. Don't go overly offensive if you keep dying, but don't stay full beef mode if you never die but your guild fails to make DPS checks. Much more information about gearing is coming out with the Blood Decay Wowhead guide, so if you're watching this by the time that's out, I'll have it linked in the description for you to check out. But that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.